I'm also very proud to be on stage with my two think tank colleagues. Some of us are collaborating, Robert. It's good news. Danielle Goldfarb is the Associate Director of the Global Commerce Division of the Conference Board of Canada, and she will be presenting a chapter that she's written for the book that Taylor and Roland are editing. And Ailish Campbell, who is the Vice President of Policy for International and Fiscal for the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, will be commenting. So the full bios are in your programs. Without further ado, I will invite Danielle to come and start her presentation.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thank you to Roland and Taylor for inviting me to be part of this. I'm really honored to be part of the group. New York Times journalist Thomas Friedman told us that the world is flat. And it's true. Businesses are accelerating their use of supply chains that extend across borders and that extend to both the emerging and the developed world. Yet, if you look at it from Canada's perspective, the world can still seem a little bit round, at least in one particular sense. So over the past decade, Canada has seen growth in our imports, we've seen growth in our two-way investment, but our exports have flatlined. Essentially, we're focusing our exports largely in the U.S. market, and while companies have started to go beyond the U.S. market to some degree, that hasn't offset the overall stagnant trend in our exports. And this is not merely an academic issue. This lag in export performance matters for Canada's living standards. And we have a relatively small domestic economy, and that economy limits our companies' growth potential. Our companies need to look for growth opportunities elsewhere. And with that imperative in mind, I'm going to look at 6 trends and challenges global trends and challenges and what they mean for Canada. And I'm going to look at 6 policy principles we should keep in mind as we try to develop our long-term global commerce strategies. So the first, which I already talked about, is globalized production. And it is true that the world is getting flatter. It's not completely flat, but the fact that we've had declining communications costs and the ability to digitize information and send it anywhere globally means that it's much easier to coordinate activities globally. And there are a number of implications of this for Canada. I'll just highlight 2. Basically, Canadian companies cannot just compete globally with kind of a middle-of-the-road product. They need to have a world-leading product. They need to be absolutely ready to compete in global markets. They need to be constantly innovating, and they need to be, they need to be ready. They need to be prepared to compete in global markets at every part of the supply chain. At every aspect of the supply chain, at specific aspects of the supply chain. So they need to, even if they're only competing in the Canadian market, they need to be able to compete against global players at each part of the supply chain. The second implication, which we already heard a bit about, is that Canada has a large stake in the effective functioning of the global economy. So because there's so much global production, we're so tightly integrated, the global economy is much more tightly linked than it has been in the past. Our economy, we as a country have a much greater stake in the effective functioning of the global economy. And we could see in the 2008-2009 recession that Canada and many other countries in the world suffered more than they would have in the past because of the deep global linkages. But on the other hand, the fact that we were so globally integrated meant that the protectionist instinct of many countries was actually blunted, because they knew that, if they protected themselves, they would only be effectively shooting their longer-term interests for recovery in the foot, essentially. The second trend after globalized production I want to look at is emerging markets. We've already heard a lot about this, that emerging markets now represent, in purchasing power parity terms, half of the global economy, and hundreds of millions of people have been lifted from poverty in the last decade, over the past few decades, in large part due to openness to trade. We've really shifted the conversation away. We're not talking about poor countries anymore. We're talking about emerging markets. We're not talking about developing economies. It's all about fast growth markets. And I think it extends beyond the large economic powerhouses of China and India and Brazil to the next tier of emerging markets like Turkey and Indonesia and Mexico and Nigeria. And these markets represent much greater growth potential than do Canada's traditional trade partners. However, of course, these markets can be extremely challenging markets, challenging places in which to do business, and they can have different norms than Canada's traditional markets have. And so Canadian companies now need to make sure that their entire supply chain meets reasonable health standards, even if it's partly integrated with countries which have different health standards and norms. They need to make sure that they're aware of the working conditions across their supply chains, that they're maintaining appropriate ethical standards across their supply chains, at the least to protect their reputations that can be quickly and easily destroyed. And also, companies need to be actively protecting their intellectual property by innovating constantly and finding trusted partners in new markets. So stealing ideas is a big one. The third issue, I'm going to look at a third trend or challenge is China's rise. And of course, this is, a subset of the broader issue of emerging markets rise. But China's rise, in particular, is dramatically reshaping the global economy. And Roland already referred to the China-Russia deal, energy deal that has been just struck, and that's going to have a huge impact on Canada. So China's rise is dramatically reshaping both the global economy and with it the Canadian economy. For example, if we look at the U.S. market and Canada's market share in the U.S., China is largely responsible for our loss of market share over the past decade in that market. Moreover, Chinese companies are now moving up the value chain. It's not just about lower-end manufactured products. They're moving up to higher value-added production. And so that, again, Canadian companies are going to face more intense competition at all stages of the supply chain. At the same time, of course, China represents a huge market where the scale and growth opportunities on offer are massive, and in China and other emerging markets as well. So China leads me to the fourth point, the fourth trend or the fourth issue, which is the resource boom that emerging markets rise has meant for Canada. And so basically, as demand in emerging markets and China in particular has grown, that's created a surge in demand for a lot of things that Canada has. For example, energy, minerals, lentils, wheat, forest products, all kinds of natural resources. And there are many implications of this. I'll mention a couple. Basically, as demand for these things that we're good at rises, the boost in prices of these products really generates a wealth increase for Canada and for many Canadians, not just in the parts of the country which have the resources, but across the country, and in turn creating better living standards for us. It's led to shortages for specific skill sets. It's highlighted and led to a very big discussion about major infrastructure gaps in getting our resources to markets, especially in Asia. And it's also heightened concerns about carbon emissions from oil sands production. At the same time, the global resource boom has actually coincided with a great shift in the U.S. energy landscape. And basically with huge dramatic increase in U.S. energy supply, raising concerns that Canada no longer enjoys a guaranteed energy market, and heightening pressures for us to get our resources to new markets. So then my next point is about technological advance. So number 5 is technological advance. And of course, technological advance has all kinds of implications. I'm going to highlight 4 of them. One is that it really makes it easier and more attractive to sell new kinds of products and services, particularly services in global markets. So we traditionally focused on selling goods and products. We thought services can only be sold locally, but now our services and expertise can increasingly be sold in global markets. And despite the fact that we traditionally pay more attention to resources and manufactured goods because they're much more visible, services trade actually represent a significant part of Canada's trade. When we measure it, it's actually about 40% of our trade compared to actually 16% or so in our official statistics. So it's actually not a marginal part of our trade, it's significant. And in fact, if you look at Canada's fastest growing export sectors, of course resources are up there, but services are also amongst the fastest growing. There are a number of service sectors amongst the fastest growing Canadian exports. So technological advance has now made that possible, and that's something that Canada is very good at, and it holds a lot of potential for our future. Technological technological advance also creates new types of products and services that can challenge our traditional economic assumptions. For example, 3D printing, where you can now customize manufacturers close to the customer, and that can cost as little as those that are mass-produced. So that sort of turns our traditional economic assumptions on their head. Technological advance also creates a premium for skilled labor, leaving less skilled workers behind, and we need to think about that. And of course, technological advance also makes it easier for companies to steal our ideas. And we talked a little bit about cyber theft. So we need to think more carefully about how do we protect our ideas. Okay. I see I don't have too much time left. So the last point about the trends is that geography is strong. Our geography we live next door to the US, but that has given us a huge advantage, but can also raise challenges because our exports are focused on the slow growth US market. So what are the 6 principles that we should use to powerfully advance our interest if we are since we are a small global power, small global economic player, we need to be bold and innovative. Nobody's going to listen to us or pay attention to our interests if we are not. And so I've got 6 principles which I'll go through very quickly. One is to think global but act local. Basically, we need to pay attention to domestic policy issues that are going to enable us to be more competitive in global markets. We've got to prepare our entire workforce for global shifts and opportunities. We've got to make sure our companies have done their homework before they go global. We need to transition workers towards higher skilled, higher demand work. And we need to prepare Canadians for short burst work patterns that are likelier to be the feature of our resource booms and bust. We need to also give more thought to aligning our infrastructure needs today with the fact that there's going to be increased demand from emerging markets tomorrow. So we need to think carefully about what our infrastructure needs to look like today. Second point, we need to use location to our advantage, but not as a constraint. We need to come to the US with some great proposals to advance our Canada-US economic relationship, to make it a seamless economic relationship, but we need to look also to new growth opportunities in other markets. We shouldn't be constrained by our geography. We should also, point 3, we need to set the global standard for openness. We need to, one way to do this would be to eliminate our barriers to international commerce. Our tariff revenues represent some government revenue, but they come at a tremendous economic cost by penalizing our companies' global competitiveness, making it more difficult for us to access the best global technologies and ideas and products at the best prices, and they don't really make sense in the context of globalized production. Fourth, we need to make it about more than money. Our trade partners care about more than trade, and we need to be at the table on issues that extend beyond our short-term economic interests. We need to be actively presenting constructive, positive proposals that improve global stability, reduce poverty, reduce corruption, address environmental issues, bolster our security in terms of cybersecurity and physical security, and address intellectual property theft. Supporting these issues advances our long-term economic interests. Fifth, we need to make it about others' interests, not ours, so it's about you, not me. Governments typically focus on where we have strengths, and we need to focus, I guess, on where other countries have long-term problems and how we can help solve those problems. Six, we need to keep it real. We need to make sure our policies are aligned with the realities of how production is organized in global markets today, including the rise of less visible types of trade like traded services and traded expertise. Attention paid to more visible trade can crowd out attention that we should be paying to smoothing the path for our traded services. And one specific example of that is that we traditionally provide loans to companies. When we're trying to provide loans to companies, we look at their manufacturing assets, like factories, as collateral for loans. But we need to start looking at how do we take into account the full value of people's intellectual property as an asset. So in short, the stakes are high. We need our companies to find growth opportunities to support rising or sustained living standards. We need to create a framework so that Canadians can best seize the benefits of the global economy while preparing them for the challenges it presents. As a small economic player, we need to be creative and bold to advance our interests. We need to model openness at home and abroad. and we need to shift our policy weight in line with the economic potential and realities, such as traded services. Our geographic realities require bold Canada-US proposals, but geography's pull should not constrain us from opening doors to opportunities elsewhere. And we need to engage deeply with others' problems and beyond short-term economic interests. So I started with Thomas Friedman, and I'm going to end with Sheryl Sandberg. So Canada needs to lean in, sit at the table, and engage deeply for the long term. And this way we can advance our economic interests while also contributing in a meaningful way to a more prosperous world.
Thank you, Danielle. Ailish?
So thanks so much to the University of Ottawa for having us here today. Thank you to Danielle for her excellent paper. And the Canadian Council of Chief Executives and our CEO, John Manley, and our 150 CEO members are thrilled to support Roland and Taylor's initiative. So from op-ed to, it sounds like an annual conference now. So I wanted to provide some comments on Danielle's paper by way of kind of a firm perspective. And let me just say the premise of my remarks here today is that trade and commerce and being an open market-driven economy is absolutely integral to our well-being as a nation, as a society, and as well helps project our strengths out to the world. And I think as Danielle and Peter Singer and others have highlighted, by doing so, we're also able to help other nations solve their great challenges. So there's definitely, I think, a lot of win-win opportunities here. What really attracted me to the Ottawa Forum's framework was the thought that new actors are essential in foreign policy and in economic policy. So I'll be, as I say, talking from kind of a firm perspective. But before I do that, let me just say two things. First of all, the state remains an incredibly powerful actor. What states do matter, and it matters greatly. It matters greatly to firms, not least because governments retain the power to tax all of us, not only as individuals, but also as firms, and what we get taxed on creates incentives and disincentives for action. States remain very important because, of course, they set the top-to-top leader-tone relationships and the strategic direction. And many of our firms are out in front of those relationships, but whether we like it or not, that's the operating environment in which we operate. And the state maintains great resources to direct, again, towards priorities. The public service also matters greatly. I'm thrilled to see some of my mentors here, Margaret Biggs, David Maloney, and of course Robert Greenhill himself, who at one point was our deputy minister at CETA. So more in and out is ultimately one of my key messages here today. We need, part of that opening up the state to new actors is also that the government become more permeable to actors that want to come in and out and serve in the public service, bring some of their knowledge and expertise, and then go on, that kind of tri-sector leadership approach that another Canadian has written about in the Harvard Business Review. So 5 thoughts flow from what I see as the central challenge, and if I could have my one slide up. What I wanted to chat about is really the fact that Canada trades and invests too little with emerging markets. The central challenge in front of Canada today is to diversify its trade. So you'll see here that traditional growth markets that are, if you will, the slow growth markets of the future account for over 85% of our goods and services trade. The fastest growing, and of course if we were to run those numbers, this is a Bank of Canada chart that only runs to 2010, but if we ran it out to 2013, of course that Chinese number might come down to something more like an average of slightly over 8%. But the point is this: the customers of the future, the growth markets of the future, are in areas where Canada does not have as developed a network as it needs in terms of FDI, firms, export trade, and services trade. So this is the central problematique that I would put in front of you today. So what do firms care about, and how are they approaching these challenges? Well, they care about 5 things. Customers, keeping the ones that they already have and getting new ones. They care about the operating environment, including taxation. They care about talent and moving their people around. They care about having the capital to grow and to value their companies correctly, and they care deeply about logistics. So I'll make comments on those 5 points quickly, and then I'll conclude with a call out, if you will, to the research community that's gathered here today. So on customers, we want to keep the ones we already have. I mean, any good economist would look at this chart and say, well, I like the 85% because it's focused on some very rich nations and consumers. So we have a strong relationship with the US. It accounts for about 75% of our goods and services trade. That's primordial. I don't like looking at the US relationship through the one singular challenge that we're having today, which is Keystone. But I think Keystone actually, if we broaden out our lens, suggests something that we have to do better, which is direct policy towards public concerns and public interest in resource development. So one of the thoughts that I have for the future is a GHG emissions strategy for the oil and gas sector that's North American wide and includes Canada, the US, and Mexico. I'd like to see a North American price on carbon that extends out the regimes that we already have in Alberta, in Quebec, and BC out to a North American platform. And we can only do that with partnerships that look beyond the narrow concerns of one specific pipeline, although I absolutely think Keystone should go ahead, given that there's already over 80 pipelines that cross that border, including about 6 at the same scale as Keystone. But whatever we need to do to solve that challenge, both with the Canadian and American public, we need to work on that. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the Canada-EU trade agreement in the Q&A session, but needless to say, this is an important traditional market that we want to hang on to. And I think we're going to see a new generation agreement. The government's negotiated, and Steve Verheuvel and his team have negotiated something that includes services, temporary entry, investment, and I think that's going to be very positive for Canada, and even hints at something we've also got to look at, which is reform to our supply managed sector. The big thing about getting new customers is the lack of a strategy for China. Canada, kudos to the government for concluding the Canada-South Korea deal. I think that's epic. In a way, I would have preferred if Japan had been our first partner because they are more heavily invested in Canada, and I think Canadians have a high degree of trust and a little bit more knowledge of Japanese products, but we've picked a great competitor and a great place for inputs, but we've got to be ready for the challenge that's going to come when that trade agreement is implemented. I'd like to see us have an advisory committee for Asia that includes firms, NGOs, the diaspora communities, as well as leading Korean thinkers so that we can really make the most of that potential agreement. We've got TPP, but what's our plan B? Without a strategy for China, Canada's totally flat-footed. We need to look at a strategic dialogue like Australia has, like the free trade agreement, for example, that New Zealand has had, that has increased its trade in agriculture alone with China by 5 times in the 6 years since it was signed. These are the kind of innovative tools that the government, I think, absolutely requires if we're to capitalize on growth markets. Basically, we need a public conversation on Asia, and to that end, I'd highly recommend the work. I happen to be on their board as well of Canada 2020, Rana Sarkar, the Asia Pacific Foundation, and others on Asia. There's a long conversation to have there. Taxation, we need agreements with emerging markets. And if we don't have info-sharing agreements with tax havens, we're not getting the full picture. On talent, we need to move professionals around. We need to move Canadians out, and we need to move their global workers into Canada for short periods. On talent, I'd also say that I think universities should be exported. We're tying ourselves in knots about the number of foreign students we have in Canada, and really what I'd like to see is more universities of Canada established in growth regions where we can both educate larger numbers of populations in emerging markets, but also send Canadian students out and not keep them in Canada, have more of a gap year or have more of a world experience through universities abroad. On capital, our financial system needs a look in terms of innovative new products. Danielle is bang on when she says banks need to start getting more creative about lending against intangibles, and so does EDC and so does BDC. Our Investment Canada Act needs a total relook. The Investment Canada Act has been very damaging in an interesting upstream part of the economy, and that is specifically the valuations for junior mining and exploring companies. And Eugene Bellew at the University of Calgary has done some interesting work on this. And we need to understand Asian forms of capitalism better because state-owned enterprises will continue to invest in Canada. Finally, logistics. Canada has to work harder as a general principle to attract and retain business, and our logistics networks must be the best in the world. Robert, the World Economic Forum's report on trade competitiveness really singled this point out for us. We need to embed more GPS, more intelligent systems, more tracking, and I think then we get at some of the work that David's been doing on regulatory cooperation and border issues with the US, which I'd be happy to expand on in questions. So finally, shout out to the research community. I don't think we are properly measuring Canada's global economic footprint. So the Canadian Council of Chief Executives is thrilled to support the work by Danielle and her team and by researchers like Dan Kuriak and others that are trying to measure our trade and services, look at the value of our intangibles, better understand state-owned enterprise investment in Canada, and really push out our understanding of Canada's global economic footprint, including, I would note, foreign affiliate sales, which have overtaken global exports in terms of their value for the Canadian economy. Looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Ailish. Thank you. Lots of things to talk about there. I'm glad that Ailish brought up the education, exporting education issue. We're actually, the CIC and the CCCE are putting out a report in a couple of weeks on an international education strategy. So watch for that. I'd love to pick up on some of the discussion we started with Robert and that Danielle continued about natural resources. It's a subject close to our heart. I see Madeleine Drohan, the author of the CIC report, sitting in the audience. I'm sure she'll have something to tell us about what we're thinking so far and what Danielle is thinking. And I think Ailish brought up a number of things that really sitting on the table. Both of these very smart women, production structures. I guess I'll just kick it off with my own question about North America and about competitiveness and innovation. You're talking about sort of global production structures and global production chains, and there seems to be a big movement in the States now for reshoring. That Obama's Council on Competitiveness is doing this big reshoring, project, and they're talking a lot about it in terms of bringing jobs, manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. And a lot of the justification is not just the job creation, but the fact that innovation happens more readily when there are clusters and when production chains are shorter. Is that something that you've been working on at all, Danielle?
Does this work? So essentially, I was sort of simplifying when I said, the world is flatter and so on, but essentially most production chains are regional. So while, this is true for Canada, the US, we are mostly engaged with our own region. And the same is true within Asia. We talk about global supply chains, but really often a lot of the activity is taking place within Asia. So, to create your iPhone or to create any Apple product pretty much is designed in California, but throughout Asia, all the components and parts are kind of being put together, are being pulled together and then being sort of put together with the final touches in China. So, and then shipped to North America or other parts of the world. So basically, these supply chains tend to be regional in nature. So it's sort of, about the pull of geography. We tend to be, even though we have all the communications that make it, and the ability to digitize information and send it anywhere globally, we do prefer to trade within our region, and that's going to be, we are closer to the customer. So this trend towards reshoring, when things get more expensive to ship and so on, we're going to want to be closer. We're going to want to be more responsive. Sometimes you want to, when there have been, I think Robert brought up the issue of resiliency in supply chains. Sometimes when there has been a problem in a supply chain globally, firms decide that it makes more sense to locate to locate closer to their customer and closer to home so they can resolve issues more quickly. So this is a business decision, but it's most of these supply chains tend to be regional in nature, and that's kind of, Ailish's slide. That's what accounts for the fact that we do most of our trade in our neighborhood. And that's the key challenge we're sort of we're dealing with. Do you want to add?
Yeah, on competitiveness, I think we have a central question in front of us over the next decade, and that is that the ability of firms to source from the most cost-effective, productive source is certainly in front of us in North America, and we have a huge advantage. And I'm looking forward to Andrew Leach's presentation around energy and manufacturing. We have a huge natural and comparative advantage in North America in energy as an input. At the same time, I've got to feel that our most important trading partner, the United States, over the last few years, has sent us some very troubling signals about where its policy intentions are headed. Whether that's lack of momentum on the border, whether that's the inability to crack in both countries our agricultural subsidies that distort global markets in agriculture. Or whether that's, the politicization of the Keystone Pipeline without willingness to move forward where Canada already has for GHG emissions on coal, and now to the next step, which is to work together on the real issues around climate change. So I think what's interesting is that Canadians and Americans and Mexicans, I think societies are becoming closer together. I think firms are becoming more wired, and by their very nature, governments are domestic. So how do we create governments that are more sensitive? And particularly, again, we're always going to have to work harder than the Americans because they are just so much more proportionately important to us than we are to them. So of course we're going to have to be thought leaders. Of course we're going to have to push the envelope here, and we're going to have to take the first step. But any way that we can kind of bring those imperatives to our governments, I think, is the real challenge in front of us. And then the question is, are governments going to follow where customers and citizens and firms are already going?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sure we have some questions in the audience. If anybody who has a question can raise their hand, we'll get the microphone to you. And if you could identify yourself, that's great. Right at the back there, if you'd like to start. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Patrick Lemont, University of Ottawa. I guess my common question is both for Danielle and Ailish. I think you've set out the strategy very well as to, in a way, where we need to go and what we need to do. My question, and Ailish's last comment is very much in that direction, is how are we going to do it? It's one thing to say we need to develop emerging markets. As Ailish's slide demonstrated very well, 8% of our trade goes there, but it's a lot harder to penetrate and develop those markets than it is to do so in the United States or Europe. And especially, if you're a small, medium-sized enterprise, how are we going to do this? The same when we talk about technology. Certainly, we hear a lot of reports about how Canadian firms, in a way, are lagging behind in terms of developing new technologies. There are questions about whether we even have, the financing structure. I mean, Daniel talked about, banks financing intangibles. I don't know when that's going to happen when they have problems with financing tangibles. So venture capital is a big problem in Canada. So how are we going to address this? It's nice to say be bold. Let's integrate ourselves into global supply chains. I totally agree with that we need to do this, but how? And in a way, is there a role for government, or is it the role for the private sector, or for larger Canadian companies? So I'd like to hear more about this, because I think this is that's where as we say, the rubber hits the road. If we're going to move to that that level that you're talking about, which I think we need to do in terms of future prosperity for Canada. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's the $1 million question. I appreciate that. Yeah, I would say one thing, and we've done a lot of research on this. We just completed a study at the Conference Board where we looked actually at the experience of every single Canadian company that had gone to an emerging market over a 15-year period. And we looked at which factors enabled them to succeed and which factors meant that they were likely to fail. And one of the things that came out of it is that those companies that had the right set of capabilities, that were innovating constantly, that had the right amount of experience, that had a world-leading product, and had established a global reputation, were those that were likeliest to succeed, and those that we're inadequately prepared, we're likely to fail. So I think a key part of this has to go back to this point about, thinking global but acting local. A key part of this has to be, part of this has to be opening doors to, via free trade agreements and sending out trade commissioners and so on, and dealing with building relationships with other countries. But part of it has to focus on the capabilities of our companies at home and making sure that we don't encourage companies to go global before they're ready, and that we make sure that our companies are in the best. We're providing the right environment for Canadian companies to, we're helping them develop the right capabilities in order to be global. So we shouldn't be encouraging all of our companies to go global, especially to emerging markets, because we're not going to see, that's not going to help us penetrate these markets. We should be encouraging companies to develop the right capabilities, to do their homework before they go global. So that's one part of it. You may have other.
I just add our 150 firms. So there's 1.2 million business enterprises in Canada. The Canadian Council of Chief Executives has 150 members. They're responsible for more than 50% of Canada's exports. Let's just be clear, they're not doing it in one way. They're doing it through establishing foreign affiliates. They're doing it like the amazing, what people may know here as, Aeroplan, now AMIA, a global loyalties company that's creating joint ventures in China to bring some of its analytics and back office and branding capabilities to China. Over 3 billion pieces of plastic for Chinese customers are going to be plugged into this system. And they're doing it, of course, with other forms of joint ventures on the ground, Linamar, Magna, Bombardier in China. I think we have another huge opportunity in India. We're pleased to support the government in the CEO Forum with India. This is a much more difficult market to crack, far less predictable than China. And huge opportunities, though, particularly in food security, in IT. But again, Canada has to be ready to also accept Indian expertise and Indian investment, and that's going to look like temporary entry. That's going to look like sharing back office function with Indian IT expertise. And it's also going to look like, as I say, the education piece, where I think we have to think not just about patting ourselves on the back for taking more foreign students that end up paying 40% more than domestic students for consuming education here. We need to think about how we can get out into that market. But it's going to take innovative SMEs, large firms that are already leading the way and have established business presence, and great partnerships like with Stu Beck, the High Commissioner there, and his team, who are doing a lot of foresight and identification of opportunities for Canadian firms.
Next question. Right here at the side, please.
Hello. Is this working? Yes. My name is Bob Haig. I'm a senior fellow at the University of Ottawa. Prior to that, I spent 38 years with the department that loves to change its name. My question, I think it's to both panelists. The premise has been that Canada has an open market, and I just wonder how open it is in facing the challenges of globalization. We all know about supply management and the cost to the Canadian consumer for that, but there's other areas that are protected by law that I would submit are very much part of the globalization, and that is banking, air transport, and telecommunications. And I just wonder, without changes in those areas, how effective everything the panelists have said is going to be. Thank you.
Let's get at something that I think is a key theme underneath your question, which is scale. So I think all foreign ownership restrictions should be eliminated. That should all be looked at. Thank you, Andrea. Take a look at the 2006 Red Wilson Compete to Win report. It's still fresh. There's still a lot of work that we haven't done there. But in opening up our markets, we have to take a look at whether we're ready to also allow, for example, some mergers to happen in Canada, so that we have firms that are at global scale and that compete. I think it's one of the great travesties of our economic development that somehow we haven't exported more of our telecom expertise, and dare I say it, even with TELUS customer service to the world. But the other things that you talked about, supply management, an orderly transition that protects farmers' incomes, and that reduces the price for consumers. Sure, let's look at it. I mean, but I reject any kind of suggestion that Canada isn't already very open to the world on any sort of absolute metric that we could come up with. I would just say, Bob, that I call DFAT-D or DFATE, or as you say, the department that likes to change its name, international. I just follow the email address. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that the evidence in favor of inward investment is. The economic evidence in favor of inward investment is very clear that it really is beneficial to Canada, and the same with outward investment. And that if we do want to have a forward-looking policy, it has to be that sort of more openness in that area is consistent with globalized production, and I think that we can still have. I think the importance is clarity too on those issues. We can still have some restrictions in the name of national security and et cetera, but we have to be transparent and clear about them, so that it's not a guessing game for countries and companies that want to invest here.
I think we've also got to look even earlier in our education system about when we're bringing the world to our children. One of the things that I was struck about this Ottawa Forum map that you look at, it drives me crazy that the map always ends cutting off Vancouver from the coast of Asia. We need a new map that we should put in schools that somehow shows Canada right in the middle and outlines how our coasts are actually very close to Europe and very close to Asia. I don't recall growing up anyone talking to me about China or India. I had schoolmates that were from those countries, sure, but I just say I'm intrigued. I'm intrigued by children's television, that it seems much more multicultural and international, but we need maps and teaching tools to start creating that global mindset in our children, and it starts way before they get to be 25 and join the Foreign Service.
We'll start working on that map at the conference board right away.
Great idea. I don't have very much time left, so I'd like to take about 3 questions now quickly, and then get our 2 speakers to answer them in quick succession. First one here.
Robert Miller, Nipsia. I'm interested in your views on commercialization and investment of governance reform, and specifically in the state sector. There's an interesting new book by Micklethwaite on the Fourth Revolution, the imperative of changing the state, and evidence of reform taking place more in some developing countries than in the North. So far, we've addressed these things through little state-funded institutions which don't even begin to address the scale of the challenges. Do you see any evidence that the world of commerce, consulting, Bob Greenhill mentioned McKinsey as an example of a consulting firm that takes some interest in this. Michael Ignatieff 10 years ago suggested this is an area in which Canada could be a global leader, but so far there's no evidence that we're doing this. Any thoughts you'd have on that would be appreciated.
Great, and now I'll take a couple more questions. There's one here on the side towards the front. And there's one, Steve Saidman, there as well, so we'll just ask. Okay, great. Right here in the front.
Hi, I'm Ann Golden. Right now I'm at Ryerson and at the Wilson Centre, but I was with the Conference Board of Canada here for many years. And so we were part of that Red Wilson study, did a major piece for him. And I have to admit, even though the Conference Board has and is, and based on all the logic that Danielle and the team does, certainly understand all of the benefits of free trade for Canada and all of the rest of it. I never was able to drink all the Kool-Aid. And
no one ever should.
So just 3 points, and see, my question is, have you thought of the downsides of some of this? For example, in emerging markets, there are tremendous practical problems on the ground. And when I speak to CEOs that have tried to do business in China, tried to move their companies over, only to find that they make a deal, go there and have every single bit of the IP taken, and the deal is not a deal. There's real issues as to why people don't love to open up companies and risk everything they have. When we talk about scaling our companies up so they can compete. I personally feel very glad that we never scaled up our banks on the basis that bigger was better, because we would have been in the same soup as the American banks, and we didn't buy into all of the new structured investment vehicles, so-called innovation, built on bogus. And no, really, if you've read any of Michael Lewis's books, you know, and on the supply chain question, where I am persuaded, and certainly all of the evidence has been that on the agricultural side, it's too protective and all the rest of it. I've actually talked to some of these people who have these supply chains, and it's not just a total picture, black and white. There are some benefits, actually. And for example, on the telecommunications side, I'm glad that we have some protection. So have you thought, you know, in our country where we, I think our national identity very much benefits from a CBC and things like that. And protection for our national magazines. Have you thought of the downsides of this global engagement, no holds barred picture?
Well, I think I started my comments by saying that governments matter, states matter. And you pointed out several instances where regulation really matters. One of the reasons I think the Canada-EU trade agreement is going to be so successful is because I think European Union member states and Canada are very aligned about a role for a strong state, a state that has room to regulate. So let me say that as one big picture. The second thing I would say quickly is that scale can be achieved in many different ways. So inside one firm is one option, SMEs joining global value chains is another, but I'm really intrigued as well about how Canada is putting together cluster approaches. Two strike me as really interesting ways of achieving scale without necessarily getting massive inside one firm. One is around Communitech, and you know, Jim Basili and Tom Jenkins and others in that community who, with the University of Waterloo, have created a great incubator. You know, that helps them, frankly, as well, too, because they're able to have, you know, a VC wing, an acquisition wing, as well as their own internal R&D strategies, and drawing on the university. So that cluster approach is really smart. And I think what we're doing in aerospace, where we're understanding and projecting out what skills are needed, where that industry is in conversation with higher education institutions and colleges about the skills that are needed, and then projecting out to global customers. And I would just say, you know, none of this is supposed to be easy. And I think that's one of our challenges. We've got a big market next door where we have complete simpatico cultures, legal traditions, and language. And the challenge for us is to get a little more uncomfortable.
Thank you. I'm going to give the last word to Danielle. I apologize to Steve and to Deborah and to others who may have had questions. I hope we can address some of the issues that you were going to bring up later on in the session. Danielle?
I'll just briefly address Anne's point about emerging markets and the fact that we have that it's difficult to do business in some markets where there's very significant practical problems. I mean, I will echo the study that we did is called Not for Beginners. Should SMEs go to fast growth markets? You can look it up on the Conference Board website. And essentially, you know, these markets are not for beginners. These markets are for businesses that have the capabilities to succeed, that are innovative, that have something really to offer that is world leading, and that are going to be able to be constantly innovating. So we looked at whether they introduced new products into emerging markets frequently, and lo and behold, those that did introduce new products on a regular basis were much more successful than those that did not. And so, you know, these are, because they're challenging markets, doesn't mean that we shouldn't go there. There's huge, tremendous opportunities in those markets, but not all of our companies should be going there. And I think also we should be. It's about the sort of, you know, it's not me, it's you principle. We should be trying to figure out how we can be the solution to some of the problems that these countries do face. How is it that we kind of flip our thinking on its head and figure out how is it that we can provide solutions to some of the problems, the long-term problems that some of these countries have when it comes to, you know, energy efficiency or energy in general, or food security, or, you know, a lot of the areas in which water, a lot of areas in which Canadian companies have a lot of both products but also expertise to give, and I think that's part of how we have to look at these issues.
Thank you very much. And issues such as corruption, if we're on the ground. I think that one of the things that Danielle says in her paper that sounds pretty simple, but is actually really profound, is the fact that our trading partners actually care a lot more about just trade, and we should be very aware of that. So thank you, everybody, for this and for this session. And I think we're breaking now. Is that right, Roland? For half an hour. So enjoy your break.